This is the big one. In this video, I curated 20 minutes out of a total of 2 hours of content from episodes 3 and 4 from the David Sinclair podcast. The content in this video revolves around NAD boosting, which is at the core of David Sinclair's research at his Harvard lab. This is the video you're going to want to watch a couple times and share with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Enjoy the highlights.
In the past, our bodies were constantly fighting disease and deterioration throughout life. Even before birth, we're fighting against entropy. Things are falling apart. The aging clock that we can now measure begins at conception. But if you fast forward to now, our society is built on comfort. Most countries have enough food and shelter. We can sit down. We don't have to run away from predators very often. And this is a real problem because these longevity defenses that normally would be activated by being cold and hungry and running are lethargic. The body doesn't expend energy to defend itself unless there's a need for it. And modern society is the worst thing. We love comfort. It feels good, but that's the worst thing for long-term health. We need to trick the body into getting out of its comfort zone by doing these things we've talked about: eating the right foods, including foods that are stressed, eating less often. And as long as we have adequate nutrition, that's what we call it, intermittent fasting with adequate nutrition, or IFAN. This is another term we just coined in this podcast. That allows the body to turn on these defenses without suffering long-term negative consequences. What's interesting, I find, is that even though we know the fridge is probably full with food, our bodies are not that smart. Our bodies don't get that message. And we can trick the body into thinking, oh my goodness, the fridge is running out of food, or the field or the forest is lacking in food. We better get to hunger down and survive. What are those things? You burn fat, you increase your metabolism, so you've got more energy to run around and find food. You become more alert because you've got to go find more food, and you defend your body against insults, whether it's incoming infections or diseases from within. And that's cool that we can trick our bodies. And it's not that hard. We just need to do the things we're talking about on this podcast. Sitting down is bad for us. You atrophy, you have less muscle, which means your hormone levels, particularly testosterone, will go down, and you become, in pain. That's not a good thing. But ultimately, if you have not a lot of muscle in your hips, particularly, you can break your bones when you fall over, when you're older. And all of that means you need to get off your butt, stand up, even better, go for a walk, even better, go for a run or cycle to get what we call a hypoxic state going. Your body needs to suck in more oxygen, and that has remarkable health benefits. Exercise isn't just beneficial for your fitness and for your vitality. It actually can stop diseases in their tracks. Exercise can slow down cancer. In fact, it can prevent up to 23% of all cancers from occurring. That's true for cardiovascular disease. In fact, it has an even bigger effect on that. 30% reduction just by doing moderate exercise every week. 50 minutes is sufficient, or 3 times a week with 10 minutes. All-cause mortality, right? So all-cause mortality is basically slowing down aging. That's a 27% reduction in the rate of aging just by exercising. There's a reason why vigorous exercise is so important beyond just walking and standing. It's that you have hypoxia. Low levels of oxygen are undoubtedly good for you, even though they may not feel good. And when you're hypoxic when you're panting so much you cannot carry out a conversation. That's what you're aiming for at least 10 minutes a few times a week. So why is being out of breath important? So again, it's this hormesis idea. A little bit of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So what's happening is when you're hypoxic is you're turning on what's called HIF-1 alpha, hypoxia-inducible factor. And that pathway turns on a bunch of really helpful genes that control new blood vessel growth and mitochondria. My good friend and colleague over at Harvard won the Nobel Prize in 2019 for discovering HIF-1 alpha and its role in biology. Now, the other thing that happens in that, there's 2 things. So one is the HIF-1 alpha that turns on a genetic program that's good. But what also happens is you get free radicals generated. Because when you don't have enough oxygen, those electrons that should normally be used by what's called the electron transport chain in mitochondria, which generates ATP, they fly out and they become a superoxide radical. It's harder to build muscle as you get older, and you want to maintain that muscle mass. I'm losing about 1% of my muscle mass every year unless I maintain it or build it up. As you get older, you're going to fall over, right? Everyone falls over, especially as they get older. And if you break your hip, that's close to a death sentence. A lot of people, 19 people every minute fall over and break their hip in the United States, which is a major cause of mortality. Well, it's equivalent to having metastatic cancer. That's how bad it is. But if you've got muscles and you're flexible, you do, say, Pilates in your older age and stretch, build up the muscles, particularly around your waist, then you're much less likely to break a bone when you fall. But now we know, actually, that one of the huge benefits you get from being cold is the production of brown fat. So what is brown fat? Brown fat, or often called beige fat, is found in babies. It's typically to allow them to stay warm because they don't shiver until they're about 1 year of age. And what was discovered about 10 years ago at Harvard by Bruce Spiegelman and Ron Kahn, a couple of my colleagues, is that adults also have some brown fat. And they discovered this with PET scanning. And they found it mostly exists on your back, in your shoulder blades. And when you get cold, it revs up. You get more of this brown fat. And this is a good thing because brown fat is extremely healthy. It revs up metabolism. It burns white fat. And we think that there are these factors, little chemicals, little proteins that get secreted out of brown fat that make the rest of the body healthy as well. One of the reasons we know that is because there's a gene that makes brown fat, makes cells turn brown from white to beige to brown, and it's called PRDM16. And mice that lack this gene, they don't have brown fat, but they also develop type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease as a result. Sauna bathing, as it's called in Europe, is super enjoyable. And it also is good for your skin. You get to sweat and get those pores unclogged. But this is one of the most ancient therapies for longevity. Even before Roman times, they were bathing in these saunas, though the Romans would use fires under the floor. But this is something that Europeans still carry on as a tradition, particularly in Finland and other Scandinavian countries, where these studies are typically performed on men for some reason. But the data that I've looked at, which we'll put in the show notes, is that there's absolutely no doubt that men who partake in sauna bathing a few times a week, often at home because they build this into their houses, have a dramatic reduction, up to 20% in the rate of cardiovascular disease and mortality caused by heart attacks. Really what we want to do today is to talk about some of the major supplements and medicines that are thought and have the greatest scientific evidence to be able to give you wellness now as well as long-term health in the future. Most drugs are chemicals, okay? But some are naturally occurring and some are freely available over-the-counter, OTC. And that's because they've been in our food supply before and the FDA doesn't regulate them. They fall under what's called generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. And that's why you can pick up a whole variety of molecules from the plant world because they're already in our food supply. Therefore, the government thinks, well, they're probably okay. And so that's why you always have to be careful. You have to monitor yourself, like I have been with my blood work for many years, to make sure that you're not hurting parts of your body. Your liver particularly could be sensitive to some of these molecules, even if they are available freely at the pharmacy or the vitamin shop. Different story about drugs. Drugs are regulated molecules because they have the chance to actually cause damage. And many drugs actually do have serious side effects that need to be carefully monitored and discussed with a doctor. Even those that are very safe, like we'll talk about metformin, these are regulated by the government because they are not in the food supply. They are artificial molecules that could theoretically do damage. NAD stands for nicotinamide, which is vitamin B3, and adenine dinucleotide. This is a sugar and a phosphate. The important part about it is that our cells use NAD to transfer hydrogen atoms between proteins and even DNA. That is really important for life. And without it, we can't make chemical energy, which is in the form of ATP, which we'll talk about later because that's important for metformin. NAD is found in abundance. There's many grams of it in the body. It's probably, with the exception of ATP, the most abundant molecule we have in the body. It helps us make energy, but it also has this other function that's just as important that we worked on and co-discovered in the 2000s. It activates the sirtuins, and the sirtuins are these defensive enzymes that, like the Pentagon, send out the troops. The problem is, as we get older, we make less NAD, and we also destroy it more for reasons that we don't fully understand, but it leads to a decline in our ability to fight off aging and the diseases that it causes. If you exercise, it's known, and fast, it's known to raise NAD levels. But even though even if you exercise and have the healthiest diet, you're still going to have lower NAD levels by the time you're in the latter half of your life. So that's why these supplements are thought to help, because they'll boost up those older levels of NAD to where they were when you were young, which stands for nicotinamide riboside. So that's the vitamin B3 plus the sugar without the N part, which is a phosphate. We'll get to the phosphate. That's important later. It may make a difference. But NR has been taken over the counter or through websites for since 2014, either solely just as a capsule, or there's some companies that sell it in combination with other molecules. NR was a newly discovered molecule back in the early 2000s. It's found a little bit in milk and other foodstuffs. And if it was fed to yeast, they lived longer by turning on the yeast sirtuin pathway. Generally, yeast live about 30% longer when you give them these molecules, similar to caloric restriction. And that's what this was doing, mimicking caloric restriction, because both activate the sirtuins and give increased genome stability and epigenome stability that lengthens their life. So NR has to go through an intermediate molecule. Let's start with the mouth. You swallow your NR, it'll go into the gut. Some of it will be metabolized by the gut bacteria, but most of it will go into the bloodstream and then flow around and then get taken up into your muscle and to your brain and other cells that by transporters called ENTs. And there it's converted into NMN by what are called NRKs. And then you add the phosphate and you've got this thing NMN. What's NMN? Nicotinamide mononucleotide. And then the cell puts two of those together to make NAD. Yeah, it's going back a number of years ago, it was found that NR, when given to mice, extends their lifespan by about 9%, but it was given to them late in life at about 700 days, which is a pretty old mouse. This has been like a 70-year-old human, but it still worked. But there were also improvements in health. They had more mitochondria, which is the energy. They had more athleticism, less inflammation. And so that was the first real study that said, okay, maybe supplementing with these molecules like NR or NMN might have some long-term health benefits as well in humans. I think it's worth talking about why can't we just take vitamin B3, which is a precursor to NR. And you can, but it doesn't raise NAD levels anywhere near the level that NR does. And NR doesn't seem to be as effective as NMN. So the closer you get to NAD with your molecule, the better it seems. And that's probably because you need to bring in other components. So if you just take vitamin B3, you need a sugar and the phosphate. If you just take NR, you need the phosphate. And phosphate is pretty rare in the body. It's in your bones, it's in your DNA. And maybe when you take NR, one of the issues is that you need to find the phosphate to add on there before it becomes active. NR is more popular because it's cheaper to make. It doesn't have that phosphate, which can be expensive to put on the molecule through chemistry. And that's why most people started using NR first in humans and in mouse experiments. I didn't have a horse in the race. I didn't care which one. In fact, I'd prefer if both worked according to my theories. But what we found through empirical studies, basically we're looking at which ones work better. My lab and others, including Matt Kaberlein, who's at WashU, who treated a mitochondrial disorder, and we were treating regular mice on treadmills, we found that NMN just worked better at the same dose. We don't actually understand why. It could be that this phosphate addition is one of the reasons. But just based on observations in our hands and in others, NMN works better than NR. And we've been doing these studies for the last few years in my lab. Now, preliminarily, these mice have less frailty. We've reported that out in the scientific community. They seem to be younger, having better activity, better mitochondrial function. They run further. The lifespan looks promising. We've done it once, and they do live longer on NMN. By recollection, it's about 10 to 15%, but particularly strong in females. I know a fair bit about the effect of NAD boosters in humans because I'm helping a group that is actually doing clinical trials at Harvard Medical School, and they've been giving a molecule that's similar to NMN to subjects for many years now. First of all, importantly, there's been no evidence of any negative side effects. That's important. And we're about to learn whether it actually does anything that's similar to the mice. We don't have results in yet, but hopefully by 2022, we'll actually know if people have more energy, more mitochondrial function, better blood flow, more endurance, which is what we saw in those mice. Just swallowing it is enough in our studies to raise NAD by 2 to 3-fold. There is a sublingual version. I have heard there's evidence that works. I haven't yet seen it. It makes sense that it would be absorbed under the tongue, or you can inject it. What I can say for sure is that I've seen so much data on swallowing it that it definitely works. And so our goal back in the early 2000s at Harvard was to look for any molecule that we could find that was safe that would activate the protein, not the gene, but the protein. It's an enzyme that controls other proteins, remember. And so we set up an assay that looks for what's called SIRT1 activation. SIRT1 is the first out of 7 of them in the body. And Conrad Howitz, my collaborator, and I were using an assay in a test tube that would fluoresce when you had more activity. And so we added these chemicals. We added a dozen, then we added thousands and eventually tens of thousands to SIRT1 and found which ones raised the level of fluorescence. The one that was the best at the time, which activated 13-fold SIRT1 activity, was Resveratrol. And there were others, Quercetin, Fisetin, which are actually now used by others for longevity. But Resveratrol got most of the attention because it's found in red wine. Well, Resveratrol is the equivalent of brick dust. It's really insoluble. If you put it in a glass of water, it'll fall to the bottom. So what you need to do is, we found in both mice and humans, mix it with some food. You can use yogurt, you can use that kind of olive oil, that kind of oily food, and it will dissolve. It's hydrophobic. This is the problem. It's scared of water. And when we see Resveratrol given to these rodents, what the biggest surprise was that they were protected against a high-fat, so-called Western diet. Those mice on Resveratrol, even though they were really obese on this really chunky meal, they lived as long as the lean mice that we had as the control group. And that was really, as far as I know, the first study of any that showed that you could mimic caloric restriction with a molecule and be fat, but live as healthy as a lean animal. They are what are called senolytic, kill senescent cells, zombie-like cells, the ones that accumulate over time in your body, probably because their epigenome gets screwed up. But what they do is they shut down, they stop dividing, and they start secreting inflammatory factors and also factors that cause cancer. And there are even some human studies now that show that killing off these senescent cells in the body can improve health and ultimately, we think, could extend lifespan. I was particularly impressed by the mouse studies. A couple of colleagues out at the University of Minnesota were able to show that Fisetin put in either in the food of the mouse when it's young or even late in life, after 700 days, which is like a 75-year-old human, was able to extend lifespan quite dramatically, up to 30%, including improving their health. And that's ostensibly because both it's removing those senescent cells and activating the SIRT1 defenses. So Spermidine is more recent. You've only recently been able to get it on the internet. It has an interesting history. Anthony von Leeuwenhoek, the inventor basically of microscopy, was looking at his sperm. No one believed him that there was these swimming things down there. But he started to get crystals in the sperm, and that was Spermidine. If you give Spermidine to mice, either when they're young or even late in life, they live longer and they have better heart function and other youthful capacities. There are 2 ways that Spermidine is known to work in mammalian cells. One is it stimulates autophagy, just like rapamycin does in the mTOR pathway. There's another really interesting property that seems to be true, which is it also stabilizes changes to the epigenome, which, as you know, is one of the major causes of aging. It's been used since the 1950s as the frontline medicine to bring down glucose levels in type 2 diabetics. It's relatively safe as a drug goes. In half the world, it's available over the counter at pharmacies. Here in the US and in Europe and UK, Australia, you need a prescription. A leading school of thought that most scientists agree on is that it activates a protein complex called complex 1, which is involved in making energy in mitochondria. And what it does is it lowers the amount of energy that the cell has in the form of ATP, this chemical that we use for energy. And then you get mitohormesis, mitochondrial hormesis. What doesn't kill the cell makes it stronger. And the reaction is twofold. One is to make more mitochondria, so you get more energy a few days later. But also, by inhibiting mTOR, it'll improve what's called insulin signaling so that the blood sugar that's in your blood, and if you're a type 2 diabetic, it's too high, it gets sucked out of the bloodstream and utilized, which is why it's used to treat type 2 diabetes. Metformin will lower energy, inhibit mTOR. It will activate AMPK, obviously, we talked about, that's what it's mainly doing, but it also raises NAD levels, which, as we all know, will activate the sirtuins. So metformin is a remarkable molecule, comes from the plant world. It's very simple. The targeting of aging by metformin study run by Nir Barzilai down at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. This is a very large study over many different institutes and hospitals. It's costing tens of millions of dollars. It's taking a while to raise that money, but ultimately The goal is to show to the American FDA that you can target aging with a drug and slow it down. The ultimate goal being having aging a treatable medical condition. This is a molecule from the plant world, bark and roots. You can find it's a yellow substance. Again, it's fairly insoluble, so if you want to take it with some food, yogurt, olive oil, this kind of stuff. But it's been remarkable what's been found in animals and even in people, that it can mimic the effects of metformin. Specifically, what it does is, again, it binds to this complex 1 and reduces chemical energy in the body. And in reaction, this mitohormesis is to amplify up mitochondria and make the body more sensitive to insulin and lower the blood glucose. We've seen this in my lab in mice, and human studies have actually validated this as well. The doses are high, 1 to 2 grams per day, but it does seem to work.